Would you please pray with me? Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Did you ever wonder why some things happen the way they do, why certain things go on? My mom used to always ask those kind of questions when we were growing up. We used to tease her about saying did you ever wonder questions? And she would come up with these really crazy, like, did you ever wonder why stars twinkle? And I'm sure there's explanations for some of these kinds of things, but it was always funny, the crazy questions. She'd come up with some real doozies from time to time. Crazy questions. Some of her best questions, my mom's, and best moments of wondering often happened at night. Unlike our house here in Aliquippa, and really much of this Aliquippa area around here, and where probably most of us live, it was really quite dark where I grew up. At nighttime, where I grew up, when the sun went down, it got really, really dark. When we would learn in school about certain constellations in the sky or the Milky Way galaxy, I could get home and see those things clear as day and not worry about other ambient light being around. There wasn't neighbors whose lights interfered with me seeing the skies like we have down here in Aliquippa. We lived so far from any other houses or any kind of community or town, it was very simple to see the sky outside. It was easy to go out behind the house, especially behind the wall that didn't have any windows, and see the night sky in all of its brilliance. Though if it were clear in the sky, no clouds, it was never really dark. The stars gave off a great deal of light when there's no man-made light around. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about the moon. I really am talking about stars. If you've ever experienced being out in the country somewhere and there's no moon but a clear night, it is still quite bright oftentimes. Stars can be very, very bright. On some nights, I can remember looking outside and seeing how bright it was, even in the middle of night, and assuming it's the moon, but then walking outside and seeing the brightness of the stars, only to find that it would be the North Star, or Mars, or Venus, or Jupiter, or Saturn, those kind of stars that were making so much light. And so when I read this second chapter of Matthew that we just heard, beautifully read, our narrative is for today, I don't have any trouble at all wondering about a star that was so bright that it stood out and was something special for people to follow. I can imagine that. I experienced that when I was growing up. And I can imagine it being the case even more so 2,000 years ago when there was no man-made light. Can you imagine the darkness of 2,000 years ago? Especially in a flat area like where Jesus was born. Certainly, the stars would have stood out boldly. So this second chapter that we have this morning, it's immediately the story that follows Jesus being born in Matthew's gospel. And as a reminder, in Matthew, there is no flowery birth story of Jesus. There's no babies jumping in mothers' wombs. There's no Zechariah story. There's no story of the Magnificat, Mary singing the Magnificat. There's no shepherds watching their flocks by night. There's no angels that appear to those shepherds. There's no shepherds that go to a lowly manger or stable. In fact, in Matthew's gospel, there is no stable. Jesus is just born. An angel shows up to Joseph rather than Mary and tells him that he'll have to father the Son of God, Jesus, the Messiah, Emmanuel. And then immediately we jump into our reading for today. And these guys come up to King Herod, right? Who are they? The wise men. Except wise men isn't really who they are. And if you ask some people, women, wise men is kind of a hip, ironic name, right? Wise men. Some would say there is no such thing as a wise man. Maybe a few of you said that these people that showed up were kings. That's also part of the lore of this story. We three kings of Orient, right? We've heard that song before. We're not singing it today, just to be clear. Kings, also another misnomer for these fellows that showed up. They weren't wise men. I'm not really even sure what a wise man is. And they certainly weren't kings. That's all part of much later lore. Much later societies and traditions have kind of assigned names to these people and said that there's three. In fact, Matthew doesn't even say there's three. To use words like wise men and kings leads us down paths that we do not want to go. We want to use the Greek word here, magi. And I want to use that word because we don't know what it means and it has no baggage for us already, right? Magi is a fun word too. It makes you look really smart in front of your friends. Magi, in that time period, that 500-year time period, were magicians, astronomers, astrologers. They were very wealthy. Kind of they're wealthy playboys that can go do whatever they want. And these guys are into looking at the stars, obviously, if that's how they enter into this story, right? Wealthy stargazers. Certainly wealthy enough to have means to go on a trip like this, travel from wherever they traveled from into this area. And when they get up, they show up in front of King Herod, right? And who is King Herod? The King of the Jews. And what do they say to King Herod, King of the Jews? King Herod, King of the Jews, we're here to find the baby that is the King of the Jews. Let's be clear. These magi and their huge entourage, they knew who King Herod was. They knew he was the King of the Jews. And they knew they were asking an insulting and a powerful question to this man. Where is the king, the baby? We want to see him and worship him. Now, if you were king of the Jews, and you were old and paranoid about your reign of terror and oppression, as King Herod the Great was, how do you think you would hear a question like that? From wealthy foreigners. Easy for me to say. Herod, of course, in that part of the story plays it off nicely, right? He says, well, you guys go find the baby, and then you tell me where he's at, and I'll come pay him homage. Wink, wink, wink. Right? Like he's actually going to go and pay some other baby that's being heralded as King of the Jews any homage at all. Clearly, that message is received and uncomfortable to the Magi because what do they do in the end? They blow him off, right? They go home by a different route, it says. But before they leave, Matthew tells us the Magi do something very particular when they encounter Jesus. Again, just baby Jesus, maybe a year or two old. You know what they do? They give him fancy gifts, gold, frankincense, myrrh. They kneel down and worship him. You know who does those kinds of things? Subjects of a king. Here in this moment, Matthew wants us to see that even God as king, as a baby infant, little child, is recognized not just by the Jews as their king, but by everybody as king. In that early first century day and moment, a time of anything but peace, even non-Jews will travel great distances to worship Jesus, the true Prince of Peace. So wonder with me for a moment. Wonder about the tension that's formed in this story. Wonder about all that's going on in this story. On one hand, you have this humble little child, right? Birthed in this tiny backcountry village of Bethlehem and then on to Nazareth, solely dependent on his mother for life as babies are, peaceful and full of hope and possibility as babies are. Yet even as an infant, wealthy foreigners come to worship and give kingly gifts to him. And then on the other hand, we have King Herod, old and near death, paranoid and fearful, an absolute terror to those around him, friends and family combined. Herod, who killed his own wife because he thought that she had been treasonous against him. Certainly, it's not too hard to believe that the ruthlessness of this despicable human, Herod the Great, would have no problem issuing mass genocide against little babies as this story moves forward. And so he does. Out of fear, Herod gives the orders to kill all the children in and around Bethlehem 2 years and under. And then Matthew tells us that the Holy Family, Mary, Joseph, and little baby Jesus, toddler Jesus, maybe at this time, they all escaped to Egypt to avoid this madness of Herod. And while they're gone, it says Herod the Great dies, which allows them the space to return back to the Jewish lands of Nazareth. Though Herod the Great is gone, we will meet his offspring as the story continues in Matthew. All of Herod the Great's land was divided up among his three sons, Philip, Herod Archelaus, who was mentioned in the story, and Herod Antipas, who we will know as Herod when we get to the crucifixion story. I could find myself saying much more about this story. A whole chapter at this point is voluminous. There's much to say about this, but we don't have 45 minutes. Well, we could. You just have to sit there that long. But I won't. Bible studies are a good place to come to know more about this kind of stuff. But reading through Matthew like this does give you context, right? You know what has happened, what Matthew has said, and you know what Matthew's saying in this moment, this chapter 2. And we also start to see already the great differences between the Gospels, right? Like Luke's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel. The things that we read today, just heard, they don't appear in any other Gospel. Nobody else tells us about Magi, an escape to Egypt, killing of little babies. Nothing in the other Gospels. And so I could say much, 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 much more, but I won't. Let me conclude, rather, our learning of chapter 2 for this morning by introducing the song that we are about to sing in our hymn of the day. The song is called I Wonder as I Wander. Does anyone know that song? Oh my goodness, you guys are just... Do you ever listen to music ever? Man. Well, you are in for a treat today. It's a tune from our Appalachian region, actually. Not to say it's familiar to us, but it is from this area of the country. Sort of a dark and haunting melody in G minor. Not very Christmassy, you would expect. The lyrics are equally mournful and kind of complex. Not deep so much as they are awkward in their styling and singing. And I picked this song today because it speaks of this second chapter of Matthew, and also some other things too. But it speaks of this wandering and wandering. Us Western Pennsylvanians don't differentiate too well between those two words. I would have used those two words over the whole sermon, but it probably would have just been very confusing about which word I was trying to actually use, wonder or wander, so I didn't. But there is much to wander in this story, much wandering, that is the meandering about word. Jesus and his family, they begin in Bethlehem, right? And they're forced to wander to Egypt, a long journey, for preservation. And then they wander back to Nazareth. Our chapter 2 wanders. It begins with Herod the Great and his castle wandering, and wandering wise men enter into his castle to find the real king, not Herod the Great. They wander out into Bethlehem to worship the real king, and then they wander back east. The story wanders into Bethlehem as children are killed, and finally finishes in Nazareth. And so in the midst of this story of wandering, we find ourselves in the midst of space to wonder, right? We wonder at the audacity of these wealthy foreigners, astronomers, astrologers, magicians from the east, and who have the audacity to look at any king and claim him not to be king. We wonder at the horror and the atrocities of mothers wailing for their slain children. We wonder at the difficulty of traveling for a family with a little toddler hundreds and hundreds, if not 1,000 miles from Egypt to Israel, or Israel to Egypt and back. We wonder at the God who comes to be with us in the midst of all of that. God with us as kings are overthrown and their power is taken from them. God with us as children are dying. God with us as we are homeless and journeying and feeling quite helpless. God with us as we wonder and wander. Amen.